Hello everyone. Welcome to everybody that is here with us in person and all those of you who are connecting online. My name is Natalia Alexiun. I'm Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies and Interim Director of Bad Schorstein Center for Jewish Studies. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our first event of 2026, end of this spring semester, the Norman and Irma Breitman lecture that will be delivered by our distinguished, wonderful guest, Professor Richard Breitman. I will introduce you in a moment, but now I just want to take the opportunity to let you know that this is one of the many fabulous events you want to attend. And if you are down in the south, this Thursday, we will have another opportunity to discuss his research with Professor Breitman. Will be at Aventura, and so we are welcoming you now also to plan it for your schedule for Thursday. This will be an event for Forum for Fairness in Discourse that is graciously funded by Audrey Adams and Dr. John Morris. But now let me introduce our speaker today here at the University of Florida. Professor Richard Breitman is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at American University in Washington, D.C. He truly shaped the field of Holocaust studies for many, many years now. With 14 books he had published, many of which are award-winning books translated to many languages that still continue to be the books that you want to read when you want to learn about the topic. He was also for a quarter of a century editor of one of the most important journals in the field, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Among his books are Breaking the Silence, the German who exposed the final solution, Official Secrets, What the Nazis Planned, What the British and Americans Knew, The Berlin Mission, The American Who Resisted Nazi Germany from Within, FDR and the Jews, and The Architect of Genocide, Himmler and the Final Solution. So you get a sense that these are really books that engage with some of the key questions of knowledge, of politics, of international engagement with the final solution and the Holocaust. And today we have the opportunity to hear from him, from his latest book, A Calculated Restraint, and he will teach us about what Allied leaders said about the Holocaust. Dr. Breitman, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank the Bud Schorstein Center for the invitation and the people who made arrangements, Sonia Stahl, Dee Goldstein, Natalia Alexian, and my old friend Norm Goda. I'm going to give you a quick roadmap of where this is going. I have to move swiftly. Do students still know what a roadmap is? I'm going to pick out some key episodes from what I hope is a relatively continuous narrative in the book. And toward the end, after dealing individually with Allied leaders, I'll try to sum up and make a judgment about where things stand in retrospect. Why what Allied leaders said? Well, in democratic countries, it's part of a leader's job to give public speeches and focus public attention on what is important. In a dictatorship, it's a little less so, but Stalin did give a few key speeches. And speeches about the Holocaust could express sympathy toward Jewish victims and Jewish leaders, and some refugee activists themselves thought during the war that a statement from a president or a prime minister would do some good. Some potential victims might escape in countries that the Nazis did not have full control of. Some neutral countries might help take on refugees. Democratic leaders are usually marginally involved in details of rescue or relief during times of war. In normal administrations, the specialists start by examining these things, and policy percolates toward the top. I said in normal administrations. There was a substantial gap between what Allied leaders knew and what they said, hence my title, A Calculated Restraint. Each leader had a different base of information and different constraints, political or military. So let me give you some episodes. Surprisingly, Winston Churchill is the first. During a 30-minute radio broadcast on August 24th, 1941, which is quite early in the Holocaust, Churchill declared, "The aggressor is surprised, startled, staggered. For the first time in his experience, mass murder has become unprofitable. He retaliates by the most frightful cruelties. As his armies advance, whole districts are being exterminated. Scores of thousands, literally scores of thousands of executions in cold blood are being perpetrated by the German police troops upon the Russian patriots who defend their native soil. There has never been methodical, merciless butchery on such a scale or approaching such a scale." And I'm skipping a little. "And this is but the beginning. Famine and pestilence have yet to follow in the bloody ruts of Hitler's tanks. We are in the presence of a crime without a name." That last line has become famous, but what Churchill meant by it is still disputed. If you listened carefully to what I emphasized, you did not hear any mention of Jews, either there or anywhere else in the speech. Despite that fact, Churchill's official biographer and many other Churchill advocates have said Churchill was talking about the Holocaust. Well, he was and he wasn't. He was talking about things that later we would call part of the Holocaust. But whether he recognized it as such is most uncertain. And for a long time, I could not figure out why he spoke about execution of Russian patriots defending their native soil, which was not a good way to describe Jewish men, women, and children who were executed in cold blood. And in the course of research for this book, I learned that Churchill, who wrote his own speeches, had already been under pressure from Stalin, who was struggling to maintain control under the pressure of German troops invading his country. And Stalin wanted Churchill to send British troops onto the continent in Western Europe and open a second front. This began only a month or so after the German invasion. He wanted a second front. He wanted Britain to take the pressure off of Soviet troops who were still retreating. And so he used in letters to Stalin much the same language as he used in his speech of August 24th, 1941. He wanted to praise Russian resistance and keep Stalin on side, because it would be a disaster for Britain if the Soviet Union made peace with Nazi Germany. Now, how much did he actually know about what we would call the Holocaust? Well, as you probably know, Britain had a code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park and was receiving and partially decoding German radio messages. And he certainly knew that scores of thousands of people were being executed, and he read some of the decodes about executions of Jews, but there were also executions of communists and some others. And so we don't actually know just how far Churchill extended his conclusion from Nazi anti-Semitism that the large majority of Jews were being executed. But his main purpose in that section of the speech was to keep Stalin on side. Churchill gave no follow-up speech to the world about the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Jews in conquered Soviet territory. He had bigger problems to deal with. And to go back to that speech of August 24th, if Churchill wanted to keep the secret of Bletchley Park, the successful decoding of some German radio messages, he said a little too much, because the Germans changed their code after his speech, and British intelligence recognized that and said Churchill may have exposed our secret. If he wanted to alert the world and Jews in other parts of Europe that they were in danger, he said too little. There was no mention of Jews. So that's a quick look at Churchill's key speech on the Holocaust, and as I've said, there was no subsequent speech that gave more details to the public. Stalin. Well, Stalin had a good observation post for the first stage of the Holocaust, what today is often called the Holocaust by bullets. His officials and troops were explaining that as the Germans moved into what is today the Baltic states or Belarus or Ukraine, they were killing Jews. And on September 27th, 1941, an article in the major Soviet newspaper Izvestia discussed the overall pattern of Nazi executions in Soviet territory. Stalin himself took up the subject very briefly in a speech on the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution given on the evening of November 6th, 1941. The setting then was extremely dangerous. The German army was very close to Moscow. German bombers were flying overhead. They couldn't hold a rally outdoors because it was too dangerous, and so they wanted to celebrate the Bolshevik Revolution to show that the revolutionary regime had survived. They did it in the largest metro station in Moscow. Stalin alluded to the Holocaust once by saying that the Nazis were carrying out medieval pogroms, a key word, just as eagerly as the Tsarist regime had once done in Russia. He apparently wanted to reach his Soviet audience with a comparison to known events, and he preferred familiar terms, even though what the Nazis were doing bore little comparison to the primitive pogroms. And like Churchill, he did not use the word Jews. But pogroms unmistakably referred to Jewish victims. Stalin, in that speech, called the USSR's allies Britain and the U.S. The U.S. was not yet in the war, but it was supporting the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease arms and other materiel. He said that these democracies were different in nature than Nazi Germany. He concluded, "Our cause is just, the enemy will be beaten, victory will be ours," and the crowd applauded for 10 minutes. This brief mention of a part of the Holocaust mattered. In a dictatorship, the word of the dictator moves people. And Stalin's inclusion of Jewish victims meant that the Soviet media could continue to report executions of Jews, which they did on a scale which compared favorably with Western media coverage of the Holocaust at this time. Roosevelt. FDR did not have information this good this early. The United States was not in the war until after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. At that point, American diplomats and those reporters still left in the country were interned, and the reporting of information about the Holocaust before then was very sketchy because of censorship issues, and reporters did not want to get thrown out of the country. So, but during the second half of 1942, in a story that is now well known in the literature, much more information reached both London and Washington, partly because of a telegram sent by the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland, a man named Gerhard Riegner. The State Department did not believe the story that Riegner sent, namely that Nazi Germany had a plan to kill 3.5 to 4 million Jews by way of poison gas and had constructed a huge crematorium. The State Department sat on this message and declined to pass it on to Stephen Wise, the most prominent American Jewish leader. But Wise got the information from another channel, asked for the State Department to investigate, and he contacted the number 2 man in the State Department, Sumner Welles, Undersecretary of State, who was Roosevelt's man in the State Department. Welles was more liberal than most of the department. He did initiate an investigation, and after some time, Welles confirmed the report that Gerhard Riegner had sent. So by late November 1942, Roosevelt had a reasonably good base of information about the overall Nazi plan. Around the same time, the Polish courier officer and diplomat Jan Karski made it out of occupied Europe to London, and he offered more information about killings in specific locations, although not yet about Auschwitz. And the Polish government in exile put pressure on both the British and Americans to say something about what was going on. On December 17th, after consultations between the U.S. and Britain, the two governments, joined by 15 other governments in exile, recognized that Nazi Germany had a policy of extermination of the Jewish people in Europe, and that was actually a little bit of an understatement because the Jews in North Africa were beginning to suffer as well. This declaration threatened punishment of perpetrators after the war, but there was no mention of the possibility of rescue or relief in it. It was the first official Allied recognition of Nazi policy. Neither Churchill nor FDR gave a speech about it. They still thought that the best policy was to struggle and strive to win the war as quickly as possible and relieve the suffering of all of the victims of the Nazis. But that conviction began to fray as the war continued in 1943, and more people began to argue that the killings were going at such a rate that Jews might not survive unless something was done. Also, in the second half of 1943, there was a battle between the State Department in Washington and the Treasury Department, which was connected with certain kinds of relief measures, authorization of financing for relief. And the State Department pulled some maneuvers that struck Treasury officials as unethical, and eventually the Treasury Department persuaded the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., that he needed to go to the President, and he did. And Roosevelt, in January of 1944, established a new organization to take responsibility for rescue and relief measures, and that was called the War Refugee Board. It was a small agency, a new agency, and it was told not to expect to request military resources, but they were supposed to do what they could to save potential victims of the Nazis. The 35-year-old director of the War Refugee Board, John Paley, wanted to use publicity to put pressure not on Germany itself, that looked to be hopeless, but on German satellite countries cooperating with Germany. He thought they would be more pliable. And so the staff of the War Refugee Board wrote up a hard-hitting statement for the president to issue. It led with one of the blackest crimes in history, the systematic murder of the Jews of Europe, continues unabated. It is fitting that we again proclaim our determination that none who participate in such acts of savagery shall go unpunished. All who knowingly take part in the deportation of Jews to their death in Poland are equally guilty with the executioner. So they threaten to punish war criminals. Roosevelt looked at this, and either he or his advisor, Sam Rosenman, who was Jewish, thought it was a little too much on the Jewish issue and asked for a redraft. While that happened, Germany, on March 19, 1944, occupied Hungary, where a community of more than 750,000 Jews had managed to survive persecution. The Hungarian regent, a man named Horthy, Admiral Horthy, was left in power as the nominal supreme authority, but the Germans insisted on appointing a prime minister who was willing to cooperate with Nazi Germany in almost every respect. And Horthy agreed to lend Germany 100,000 Jewish laborers. This concession served as a cover for the deportation of the majority of Hungary's Jews between mid-May and early July of 1944. But back in Washington, on March 20th, Representative Noah M. Mason of Illinois, the ranking Republican on the House Immigration Committee, attacked the Roosevelt administration for creating the War Refugee Board, which he said circumvented Congress, violated the Constitution, and opened a path for unrestricted immigration. He claimed, falsely, that the administration had already allowed 600,000 European refugees into the country during the war. And he asked, after the war, who should have first claim on the jobs available? Our returned soldiers or several million refugees? Mason, by the way, had immigrated to the United States with his parents in 1888 from Wales. Roosevelt decided now to issue the War Refugee Board statement after it had been redrafted with raising general issues of foreign policy first, and then getting to the denunciation of Nazi killings of Jews. He talked about atrocities against a number of other nationalities who were either being starved or frozen to death or murdered in cold blood. And he referred to slaughters in Warsaw, Lidice, Kharkov, and Nanking, all places that the press had made symbols of Axis atrocities for many Americans. But he retained the language of the War Refugee Board in one of the blackest crimes of history, begun by the Nazis in day of peace and multiplied by them in 100 times in time of war. The wholesale systematic murder of the Jews goes on unabated every hour and more. And he threatened specific Hungarian collaborators whom the Nazis needed to round up Hungarian Jews. It is therefore fitting we should again proclaim our determination that none who participate in these acts of savagery shall go unpunished. A reporter asked him, what about accepting refugees into the United States? Roosevelt said correctly that the Allies had set up a couple of small refugee camps in North Africa, but that not enough Jews were getting out at present to take them into the United States. That was the only question from the press at that press conference. This was, for all of its limitations, the only specific speech about the Holocaust by an Allied leader during the war. And it got major press coverage with some papers saying, this is a highly unusual thing for a president to raise. To the dismay of the War Refugee Board, Roosevelt's statement did not stop the German-leaning government of Hungary from deporting Jews to Auschwitz between May and early July of 1944. The total of the usual number is 438,000 Jews were shipped off in a matter of weeks. Only a few thousand of them survived the war. Still, the War Refugee Board kept trying with warnings, broadcasts in radio, pamphlets dropped over Hungary containing speeches by Roosevelt and other American politicians. And in late June, the Swiss government passed to Admiral Horthy a note from the United States government warning that it took a grave view of what Hungary was doing regarding the persecution of Jews and other minorities. And all who share responsibility for such acts will be dealt with in accordance with the March 24th, 1944 statement of the President. It happened that American bombers had recently begun to hit key industrial targets and, more or less by accident, some Hungarian government buildings. Admiral Horthy and other Hungarians concluded that this was delivering punishment because Hungary had disregarded the warnings about the Holocaust. Well, the War Refugee Board did not have command of American bombing targets, but Admiral Horthy decided that it was time to stop the deportations. And I'm going to make a long story short. This did not stop the Holocaust in Hungary, but it did stop the deportations to Auschwitz for several months. And because of that delay of further killing, the majority of Jews in Budapest ended up under great stress surviving the war. 119,000 in Budapest. One of the factors added to the American threats was the presence of the young Swede Raoul Wallenberg, who distributed papers to potential victims. And Wallenberg was there at the urging and with the resources supplied by the War Refugee Board. So, how do we assess the results of the efforts by the United States, including President Roosevelt, to prevent and stop the Holocaust in Hungary. It was, in terms of numbers, not a good result. The large majority of Jews in Hungary did not survive. But what were the alternatives? The two solutions which have been proposed for decades were bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz and bombing the gas chambers and crematoria. For a long time, I resisted investigating these options in detail because I'm not a military historian, and I didn't feel I had sufficient grasp of it. But this time around, I dug deeply and talked to a Holocaust historian who himself was, or still is perhaps, a pilot and taught at the Air Force Academy about the chances. Bombing the rail lines would not have worked. The War Refugee Board investigated the situation at the time and learned that the Germans were repairing rail damage within a day. You were not going to ask pilots to fly more than 600 miles to a distant target, risking German anti-aircraft fire, to do something that was going to delay matters for a day. Bombing the gas chambers and crematoria, we may want to discuss this in a couple of minutes, but according to my sources, including Ed Westerman, the pilot, was a very difficult target. It was a real long shot. The buildings had a narrow profile. There was no photographic intelligence that was specific enough to guide American bombers traveling from Italy to Silesia. And it would have taken time to work up the necessary intelligence and photographs. It is true, as David Wyman discovered in the 1970s and 1980s, that the United States was sending bombers to Silesia, and later two CIA photo analysts discovered in still classified files that there were some photographs taken of industrial facilities in Silesia that by accident got images of a couple of the gas chambers. So they were there, but the photos that were then published in the Washington Post and elsewhere after this discovery were magnified by many, many times what was possible in 1944. So I conclude that this was not a likely solution to prevent the Holocaust in Hungary, and could not have been done in time to prevent the deportation of 438,000 Jews to Auschwitz, because the deportations to Auschwitz stopped in early July of 1944. That has not prevented very prominent people, Elie Wiesel, Benjamin Netanyahu, from continuing to argue that had there only been a greater sense of morality and will on the part of the Allies, millions of lives could have been saved. So where does that leave us in terms of my findings in a calculated restraint? there was a disparity between Hitler and Allied leaders. Hitler believed that the war for living, what he called living space, and the war against the Jews were intrinsically connected. One could not be separated from the other, and he made sure that there were sufficient resources and manpower devoted to the war against the Jews. The Allied leaders did not view the Holocaust, what they knew of it early, as an essential part of the war. They recognized the moral issue, but they also felt that if the Allies lost the war, the whole world, and not just Jewish communities, would suffer tremendously. And so it took a great deal of time and persuasion for them to conclude that they should devote official resources to measures to impede the Holocaust. The turning point came in January of 1944 with the establishment of the War Refugee Board, and that was a time when the Allies had a clear margin of military superiority, and Roosevelt felt that one could take more of a risk in raising the issue. But it was only Roosevelt, and there were people even then in the State Department and elsewhere who said, you know, this isn't just a war on the battlefield. This is a war, an information war. This is a psychological war. And the more that the Western Allies talked about the extermination of the Jews, the more anti-Semites in Germany and in satellite countries would react badly and rally behind Nazi Germany. So the Holocaust influenced the Allied war effort in limited ways, particularly with warnings about Nazi atrocities and threats to punish war criminals, and some of that led eventually to the establishment of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which did prosecute crimes against humanity, including what we call the Holocaust. But let's look at the other side too. The war influenced the Holocaust in major ways. What do I mean by that? Allied leaders decided early that the war in Europe was more important than the war in Asia, even though for the United States it was the Japanese who had attacked at Pearl Harbor. Germany then joined Japan in declaring war. That was not an inevitable decision. Britain and the United States decided to invade North Africa in the calendar year 1942, at a time when Jews in North Africa and in Palestine were threatened. The Nazis had already established a mobile killing squad to move into Palestine and eliminate the Jewish community of more than 500,000. Allied military strategy and victory in North Africa prevented that. So I'm not arguing that this was an American-British strategy for impeding the Holocaust. It wasn't. But I am saying that it was a strategy that had a direct bearing on limiting the range, the extent of the Holocaust. And so we all have to balance the moral issue of not speaking out early and forcefully about the Holocaust against the credit that Allied leaders deserved for good strategic decisions. And we need to note that they were usually better at this than alternative politicians at the time. By our standards, they didn't do enough. By the standards of the time, they did enough to earn criticism from their political opponents. Thank you very much.
I'll just come to the mic for a second to thank you for this wonderful talk. And we have a few minutes for questions for our speaker. Yeah. Please go ahead. Wait for the mic so that people can listen to it also online.
Hello. I wondered what evidence you have come across about the impact of the warnings on those who were collaborating with the Nazis or with the Nazis themselves, and in whether they regarded the threats of prosecution as realistic.
Generally speaking, threats of prosecution didn't carry a lot of weight until Germans themselves concluded that the war was lost. And then a lot of people started trying various schemes to save individuals or groups of Jews and then earn immunity from prosecution. But Adolf Eichmann himself very definitely knew about Franklin Roosevelt's statement on March 24th, 1944. There is direct evidence of that.
I'm wondering if Allied leaders had come out more directly about the Holocaust, or at least what they thought might have been going on. Do you think that would have made a difference, not with Nazis, but other leaders, like, for example, the Pope, for example, or made average citizens across Europe more at ease in being saviors?
Do I think it would have made a difference? Yes. I'm not sure I heard you. You mentioned the Pope?
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's a story about that. Roosevelt had a special envoy to the Vatican, a man named Myron Taylor, who was involved in refugee matters for a number of years. And Taylor tried to get the Pope and to speak out about the Holocaust in 1942, unsuccessfully. And he came back to Washington and reported and said, either to Roosevelt or to Wells, it's not clear from the record, if the president speaks out, we can try again with the Pope. But the president didn't speak out at that time. So I think it would have made a difference for some people, but we're not talking about saving millions of people that way. We're talking about alerting potential victims to go into hiding or to try to escape across a border because of the threat endorsed by Allied leaders. Somebody once asked me to come up with a number, and we're talking about a hypothetical situation. There's no good way of coming up with a number, but it's not a number in the hundreds of thousands of people.
Thank you.
Rachel.
I wondered if you found any signs that FDR saw any connection between Nazism and the anti-Semitism in his own WASP milieu, or how he did see the relationship between those two things.
You're talking about elite anti-Semitism? Well, he certainly was exposed to it, but not in his own immediate family. His father had business connections with Jews. His mother got an award from a Jewish organization. And, you know, he was a New York politician. Jews were important to him, and some of his closest advisors were Jewish. But every so often, he would revert to a stereotype, and I'm tempted to say Roosevelt was known for telling people what they wanted to hear, and when he was talking to an anti-Semite, he could sound anti-Semitic, and when he was talking to a Zionist, he sounded like a Zionist. So it was a question of what he did, not just what he said off the cuff. But he did issue in 1944, February 1944, a statement denouncing anti-Semitism in the United States, and said no true American could allow anti-Semitism to enter into his thoughts or behavior.
To what degree do you think the Allies were right in fearing a turn of public opinion against them in satellite countries or countries kind of in the middle of the war due to anti-Semites if they addressed the persecution of Jews specifically?
Well, we know that when the United States and Britain started bombing Hungary, industrial targets, and killing some Hungarians, there was resentment, and the Hungarian government issued propaganda saying this is the fault of the Jews, and Jewish apartments were seized, and there was a market for that kind of anti-Semitism. It wasn't imaginary, but you know, sometimes you take a risk when you think many lives are at stake.
You made an interesting point about watching the Hitler speeches. I have no idea what he was saying, but I'm sure part of it was expanding the Aryan race to Russia. I know the hatred of the Jews. I've read that he hated the Slavs almost not the same way, but then you mentioned the land grab. So he would tell the people, "We're going to go and we will, amass more land." When they started losing the war, and they sped up the extermination, that part of it was gone basically. So you just had psychotic people just trying to kill as many as they could, and the expansion part. I don't know what the proper word, manifest destiny is here, but there, after Barbarossa and the things went bad, that was over. And that was just what I read or whatever.
Well, these two wars that Hitler conducted were, for him, intrinsically connected. If Germany fell victim to the Allies, it was all because of the Jews who had control or strong influence in London and in Washington. And if Germany could not win the war against the Allies, the Holocaust continued, so that Hitler could at least win that war. from the time of Hitler's first public threat against all of the Jews on January 30th, 1939, until the last day of his life and Hitler's last will and testament. Hitler insisted on continuing the war against the Jews. And that kind of focus and fanaticism, the Allied leaders could not possibly match. They had a broader responsibility and broader constituencies, and they had, to be frank, a substantial minority population that was anti-Semitic and would blame Allied leaders if they devoted too much attention to what the Nazis were doing against the Jews.
In November of 1943, when you had the Tehran conference, and I guess the first real kind of serious discussions between the Allies about punishment of Nazi war criminals. And was there any consideration or mention of what was happening to the Jews in the whole questions that were brought up about the punishment of war criminals as part of the whole mix, I guess? Anyway, that's my question.
Okay, did you say the Tehran conference, or? Yeah, well, there was a conference of foreign ministers that was a little more specifically addressed to war crimes, held in Moscow just before the Tehran conference. And Jewish organizations were not thrilled with the statement that came out of the Moscow conference, because it didn't specifically mention Jews among all of the peoples who were suffering. And that was one of the complaints, one of many complaints that Jewish leaders had with the State Department. Jewish organizations in the United States and in Britain wanted a beefed up statement that included Jews, and that was what came out of the War Refugee Board, first in January and then with Roosevelt's press conference statement in March 1944.
So I would like to ask, so from the kitchen side of this research, if you could share with us what surprised you, what findings really made you smile as you found this document in the archive and thought this is changing how we understand the story?
Certainly when I found that Churchill had, in a letter to Stalin, used much the same language about Russian patriots defending their native soil that he used in his public speech, I said, boy, that solves the problem that I had in 1998 when I couldn't figure out why Churchill was saying things in that way. So that was a big and pleasant surprise. And I will admit I was surprised also when I found, and I don't think, there are millions of books written related to this topic over many decades, but I have never seen before Roosevelt's February 1944 denunciation of anti-Semitism in the United States.
Thank you. And the last question, what is your next book going to be about? Number 15.
I'm working on something connected with German and Nazi efforts to break apart the Allied coalition, but I'm not going to go into details. Next
time you come to University of Florida, join me please in thanking Dr. Breitman for this wonderful talk. I also wanted to thank Dr. Rebecca Jefferson, who kindly brought library treasures from our Judaica collection. And please join us in Aventura. And if you can't come to Aventura, join us in the events that the Bad Schorstein Center will be putting out this semester. Thank you.